What if history was even stranger than the stories we were taught? From woolly mammoths living at the same time as the pyramids, to Cleopatra being closer to the moon landing than the Great Pyramid, and ancient inventions that feel surprisingly modern. These are the kinds of facts that completely change how you see the past. In this video, we're looking at 7 incredible history facts that sound fake, but are actually true. Let's begin. When we think of woolly mammoths, we usually imagine them living in the Ice Age, a frozen world of glaciers, snow, and early humans hunting with spears. And while most woolly mammoths did disappear thousands of years ago, not all of them vanished at the same time. Incredibly, a small group survived for much longer on a remote island in the Arctic Ocean called Wrangel Island. While ancient civilizations were growing, cities were being built, and Egypt was raising its famous pyramids, these last mammoths were still alive. That means woolly mammoths weren't just creatures from a distant prehistoric world. Some were still walking the earth, while humans were building monuments that still stand today. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 4,500 years ago, and the final woolly mammoths survived until roughly 4,000 years ago. So when people imagine mammoths and pyramids, they usually picture two completely different ages. But for a short time in history, they actually overlapped. Ancient Egypt was rising, and the last woolly mammoths were still roaming a lonely island at the edge of the world. What if I told you that Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramid? It sounds unbelievable, but it's completely true. Cleopatra lived around 69 to 30 BC. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BC. That means the pyramid was already more than 2,500 years old during Cleopatra's lifetime. Now compare that to the moon landing in 1969. From Cleopatra to the moon landing is roughly 2,000 years. So Cleopatra was actually closer to astronauts walking on the moon than she was to the people who built the Great Pyramid. That's one of those facts that really changes how we picture ancient history. A lot of people imagine Cleopatra standing much closer to the time when the pyramids were built. But in reality, she lived during the later period of ancient Egyptian history, long after the age of the pyramid builders had already passed. So even though Cleopatra feels incredibly ancient to us, the pyramids were already ancient to her too. History really can bend your mind sometimes. For a long time, many people were taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But hundreds of years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Vikings had already reached North America. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers sailed west from Greenland across the cold North Atlantic. One of the most famous names linked to this journey is Leif Erikson. He and other Norse explorers are believed to have reached a place they called Vinland. Today, evidence of a real Viking settlement has been found at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. This means Vikings were not just telling stories about lands across the sea. They actually traveled there. They built shelters, repaired boats, worked with wood and metal, and lived on the edge of a completely different continent. What makes this fact so surprising is the timing. Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492, but the Vikings reached North America roughly 500 years earlier. They crossed dangerous waters in wooden ships, without modern maps, engines, or navigation technology. It shows just how skilled and fearless Norse sailors really were. So while Columbus changed world history with his voyage, he was not the first European to reach North America. When we think of ancient empires, the Aztec Empire feels like something from a very distant past. Huge temples, powerful rulers, busy cities, and one of the most famous civilizations in history. But here's the surprising part. Oxford University is actually older than the Aztec Empire. Teaching at Oxford was already happening as early as 1096. Over time, it grew into one of the most famous universities in the world, with students, teachers, books, lectures, and scholars traveling there to learn. The Aztec Empire, as we usually know it, began much later. It rose to power in the 1400s, after the Aztecs formed a powerful alliance and began building their empire around the city of Tenochtitlan. That means people were already studying at Oxford more than 300 years before the Aztec Empire existed. It sounds strange because Oxford still exists today, while the Aztec Empire feels ancient. But history doesn't always line up the way we imagine. Some things that still feel modern are actually much older than civilizations we think of as ancient. So yes, Oxford University was already teaching students before the Aztec Empire had even begun. When we think of fast food, we usually imagine something modern. Bright signs, quick service, people grabbing food on the go, and meals ready in minutes. But the idea of buying ready-made food is much older than most people think. Ancient Romans had their own version of fast food restaurants. They were called thermopolia. These were small street food shops where people could buy hot meals and drinks without cooking at home. In cities like Pompeii, some of these counters have been discovered almost perfectly preserved. They had large clay pots built into the stone counters, where food could be stored and served to customers. For many ordinary Romans, this was a normal part of daily life. Not everyone had a big kitchen at home, especially people living in small apartments. So instead of cooking, they could walk down the street and buy something ready to eat. It may not have looked like modern fast food, but the idea was surprisingly similar. Quick food, served from a counter. For people living busy lives in a crowded city, so fast food isn't just a modern invention. The ancient Romans were doing it nearly 2,000 years ago. When we think of vending machines, we usually imagine snacks, drinks, or chocolate bars. Something modern. Something you might see in a train station, shopping center, or airport. But the idea of putting in money and receiving something automatically is much older than most people realize. In fact, one of the earliest known vending machines was invented in ancient Alexandria, in Egypt, and it didn't sell sweets or fizzy drinks. It dispensed holy water. The invention is linked to Hero of Alexandria, a brilliant engineer and inventor who lived around 2,000 years ago. The machine worked in a surprisingly clever way. A person would place a coin into a slot. The weight of the coin would press down on a small lever inside the machine. That lever would briefly open a valve, allowing a small amount of holy water to pour out. Then, once the coin dropped away, the valve would close again. It was simple, clever, and automatic. The machine was designed to stop people taking too much holy water from temples without paying. So while vending machines feel like a modern convenience, the basic idea existed nearly 2,000 years ago. Ancient history was far more inventive than we often imagine. When people think of Napoleon Bonaparte, they often imagine a tiny, angry man trying to conquer Europe. In fact, the phrase Napoleon complex is still used today to describe someone who acts aggressively because they feel small. But the strange thing is, Napoleon probably wasn't actually that short. At the time of his death, Napoleon was recorded as being around 5'2", but that measurement was likely in Old French inches, which were slightly different from British inches. When converted, his height was closer to around 5'6" or 5'7". That may not sound tall today, but for a man living in the early 1800s, it was actually fairly normal. So why do so many people think Napoleon was tiny? Part of it came from British cartoons and propaganda, which often showed him as small and ridiculous to make fun of him. Another reason is that Napoleon was often seen surrounded by his elite guards, who were usually very tall men. Standing next to them, he may have looked smaller than he really was. So the famous image of Napoleon as a tiny man is mostly a myth. History remembered the joke more than the truth.